Namaskar. Continuing with our discussion on personality, self-concept and self-image. Yesterday we have discussed the definition and meaning of consumer personality. We have also discussed personality and its nature, the difference between personality traits and personality types, the theories of personality. We have discussed the Freudian theory, the Jungian theory and the Neo-Freudian theories of personality. We had discussed just two of the Neo-Freudian theories, which was Adler's theory and Sullivan's theory, or the two Neo-Freudians which we discussed yesterday. Today we will be continuing our discussion on the Neo-Freudian theories as well as on trait theory. We will also be discussing the meaning of self-concept and self-image, and we will be discussing consumer personality, self-concept and self-image and the implications for marketer. So, continuing our discussion, the previous session dealt with the Freudian theory, the Jungian theory and some of the Neo-Freudian theories. The rest of the Neo-Freudian theory and the trait theory will be explained in this session. Now, apart from Adler and apart from Sullivan, the other third very popular Neo-Freudian was Karen Homey. She was a prominent female personality theorist of her time, and she added on to Freud's work by emphasizing on the role of social factors. Her theory came to be known as the psychosocial analysis, and she basically focused on the relationship that exists between a parent and a child, especially in the context of the early life of a child. So she explained the relationship that exists between parents and the child in a child's life. So like the Neo-Freudians, she also spoke about anxiety, and while focusing on the relationship between the parent and the child, she researched on how people strive or work hard to overcome feelings of insecurity or anxiety. Based on her approach towards on the approach towards overcoming feelings of inferiority or anxiety, she said people could be classified into three groups: the compliant, the aggressive and the detached. So based on this, a personality test has been developed which is referred to as the CAD scale. So the CAD has been successfully used and widely tested across social sciences, across marketing research as well. We will now try to focus a little bit on what these three groups are, or what these three types of people are. So the compliant are those who experience a great level of anxiety and helplessness, and they move towards others for support, for help, they like to seek social acceptance, like to seek social approval, and because they seek acceptance and approval from others, they move towards others, they like to be with others. Such people are referred to as the compliants, and they want to be loved, they want to be admired, they want to be appreciated, and they possess a feeling of being wanted, they want to be wanted. So such are people who are compliant. Then we have aggressive, the people who try to overcome their insecurities or their anxieties by forcing their power over others, or by dominating others, or even excelling over them. Through this, they tend to feel more secured, they tend to feel that things are under their control, and their objective here is to get over people before they get over them. So they want to try to control other people before other people can control them. So such people are aggressive by nature, they move against others, and the objective is to excel over others. So they want to be very successful and powerful, and they also have a desire for admiration and achievement. So in the process of trying to seek achievement or admiration, they could also become rude, or they could become cruel or selfish or very, very self-centered. And then we have the detached, who are people who want to move away from others. They are social, they are absolutely unsocial, they are very asocial in nature, they like to be indifferent, they believe that they do not want to involve with others because they would escape being hurt from them. Such people are referred to as detached. They seek freedom from any kind of obligations, duties or responsibilities, and they seek total independence, leaving them typically lonely, leaving them asocial, leaving them absolutely empty without any social relationships. They like to follow their own style. Now, as I just said, the CADs, based on these personality types, a scale has been developed which is referred to as the CAD scale. The CAD scale has been widely used in research in studies related to consumer behavior. The three personality groups are illustrative of three personality types that are varied, and different people buy different goods and services according to their personality type. So, these three personality types could be treated as three different or three separate segments. For example, the compliant consumers would like to be in the company of others. They seek social relationships, they want to be loved, admired, they want to be a part of other people's groups. So such people will move towards others. They would like to use products like mouthwashes, for example, or use a toothpaste which has a mouthwash, for example, a close-up. On the other hand, there are people who are aggressive, who want to excel over others, who want to overcome or maybe control over others. So they would like to be powerful, they want to feel powerful, and they like to have health drinks like Boost or like Bonvita, or especially Boost, which says Boost is the secret of my energy. So such people would like to have health drinks which make them feel more powerful, stronger, and get a feeling that they'll be able to excel over others or gain control over others. On the other hand, we have the detached, who are asocial people, who seek total independence and would like to create their own style. And there are people who would probably want to go in for be left alone, go in for some kind of meditation or spirituality, and they would like to go in for meditation camps or rejuvenation camps like the Vipassana or the others. So such people are detached people. So here we can look upon the compliant, aggressive, and the detached as three different personalities types, of which buy different kinds of products to suit their personality types. So if we look at an assessment of this theory, the Neo-Freudians basically draw themselves from various contributors, and they are a wide expanse in terms of content and processes as far as the subject is concerned. While they speak about tendencies within human beings to strive for perfection and excellence, fight anxiety or inadequacies and social relationships, they tend to basically ignore the biological traits. They tend to ignore the genetics involved or the hereditary involved, and so this is where this particular theory lacks and is very different from other theories, which which actually tries to ignore the importance of biological traits on a person's personal makeup. As far as the implications of the theory are concerned, they emphasize the role of socialization. Marketers here could draw in heavily because they insofar as the impact that opinion leaders or interpersonal communication could have on consumption patterns and consumer decision processes. So this will basically include the impact of family, friends, peers, culture, subculture, customs, traditions, how all of this has a role to play in a consumer decision process and consumer purchase patterns and consumption behavior. So this particular theory helps marketers draw in a lot in terms of the role that opinion leaders play or the role that interpersonal communication has to play. Marketers have also used the Neo-Freudian theories while segmenting markets and positioning their products. So personality types have been used to identify segments and position their products accordingly. So if we move, if we look at the particular theory, it has wide implications on how marketers could use the Neo-Freudian theory to discuss, to understand consumers in terms of their inferiorities, their anxieties, in terms of their desire for social relationships, and how these different types of different personality types especially proposed by by the CAD scale, how each of these can be used to identify segments and position products accordingly. Now, as we've just said, the Neo-Freudians are devoid of any discussion on the role of genetics or on role of the biological influences or the traits which have an impact on the person's personal makeup. So this leads us to another set of theories which basically gives more reference to the biological traits which people are born with or which people possess and which have an impact on development of a person's personality or personal makeup. So, this leads us to the discussion on the trait theory. Now, according to the trait theories, a person's individual makeup stems up from certain types of traits which he possesses, and the identification of such traits becomes very, very important. People possess certain characteristics or qualities or abilities, or we can say certain psychological characteristics which are referred to as traits, and people who possess a particular, all those people who possess a particular trait are said to fall into a particular personality type. So, a trait is a predisposition to to behave in a particular manner, and in order to identify traits within individuals and differentiate between them, the trait theorists basically they rely a lot on a large number of personality tests or scales or inventories. Once they have used these test scales and inventories to identify personality types amongst individuals, they group them into different personality types based on their patterns of traits that people possess. These trait theorists place people into different personality types. Generally speaking, we can classify the trait theories into two broad categories: the simple trait theories and the general trait theories. In simple trait theories, a limited number of traits are identified, and people are classified into personality types based on these traits. So, very limited or very small number of traits are identified, as against general trait theories where a large number of traits are identified and people are classified into different personality types. If you look at in assessment to the theory, unlike the Freudian and the Neo-Freudian, the trait theories possess some degree of quantification in classifying consumers or individuals into personality types. So, through the application of tests or scales or inventories, people are classified as having through presence or absence of certain traits, and accordingly they are classified into personality types. So, the trait theory seems to be more realistic, more valid, more objective as an approach. However, there are limitations because some traits tend to be vague, ambiguous, indescribable or incomprehensible, and nevertheless personality tests are used. Trait theories are very popularly used. Scales, tests, inventories are used to measure the presence or absence of certain personality traits, and accordingly people are classified into various personality types. So, how is this relevant in consumer behavior? So, this particular trait approach has greater relevance in comparison to the Freudian and Neo-Freudian theories, because this approach, the trait approach, is more objective, more realistic and more quantitative. Personality trait, the different scales or inventories or tests which have been used have been designed in a manner such that some measure single traits, others measure multiple traits. So, single trait personality scales, inventories and tests have been designed, they have been tested for validity and used in consumer research. Generally speaking, the single trait scales are more popularly used. They measure a particular trait, and based on this trait people are classified into personality types. So, finally, you can identify segments based on these personality types, based on the configuration of traits that people possess. People could be classified into different kinds of personality types. Now, as we've discussed earlier, such personality types have a big role to play on consumer needs, on their priorities, on their preferences, on their decision making style, on the level of mental and physical effort that they put into decision making, and overall in terms of the personality traits have an impact in terms of a general impact on consumer consumption patterns and decision making behavior. So, the traits or the types have an impact on the personality type, and that has an impact on consumer decision making and consumption behavior. So, the consumer behaviorists have identified general and consumption specific traits. On the basis of these, they have been able to formulate or implement suitable marketing strategies, first segmenting the market, targeting it, and then identifying appropriate positioning strategies and design the mix accordingly. Some traits are more relevant and more important or significant to consumer behavior, which are traits like consumer innovativeness, consumer susceptibility to interpersonal influence, and consumer ethnocentrism. So, we will be discussing these traits in greater length. So, let us begin with our discussion on consumer innovativeness. If we look at consumer innovativeness, it is defined as a personality trait which reflects how well a person reacts to something new. So, how welcome is he to new products or services? Does he accept them quickly, or does he take some time? Does he approach the marketplace and buy them instantly, or is he a little defensive and towards them and looks up for social approval and social opinion before finally buying it. So, innovativeness is a trait which basically reflects how well a person reacts to something which is new. The new could be a product or a brand, or it could be anything related to the marketing mix or the 4 Ps. So, a marketer basically needs to assess his segment and study it in terms of degree of receptivity towards new products or brands, or any changes made in the mix, because that will have an impact on the overall adoption, overall diffusion of the new product in the social system, and overall adoption of the new product in the marketplace. So, a marketer basically needs to understand consumer segments and try to find out which of the segments will be more receptive and to try out new products, so that they can target those segments accordingly. This will have implications on diffusion of innovation and adoption, something which we will study later in the course of this particular subject, where we will see diffusion we study diffusion in terms of how quickly a new product gets accepted, and adoption in terms of the rate at which people, or the pace at which people begin to accept new products and services. Now, innovativeness as a trait is related to other personality traits like dogmatism, social character, optimum stimulation levels, OSLs, or variety novelty seeking. So, let us speak about these traits and relate them to the type and the relevance or implication for a marketer. So, let us first talk about consumer innovativeness. It measures how open people are, how receptive they are to newer product and service offerings, or to new brands, or to changes made in the marketing mix. So, we could classify innovativeness in terms of high or low. People may be high on innovation, or people may be low on innovation. They are high on innovation when they are willing to try out new products or services or brands. When they are low on innovation, when they are they are very reluctant to buy, or even reluctant or unwilling to try out new product or service offerings. So, this reluctance or unwillingness to buy or to try out will actually illustrate innovativeness in terms of a low on a scale. So, when people are low on innovativeness, they are very reluctant, they are very unwilling to try out new products and services. So, how does innovativeness as a trait, whether high or low, how does it have an impact, or how is it relevant to a marketer? Innovativeness will basically help assess how quickly people are willing to innovate. It shows their willingness to innovate. It shows the degree of receptivity of the segment or of the target segment. It also helps you identify the most lucrative segments for a new product or service offering. It will help you forecast the rate of diffusion or the adoption of new products and services. And an innovator would be ever willing, ever ready to buy out new products and be receptive to new offerings, as opposed to people who are low on innovativeness. So, we can study innovativeness in terms of the rate of adoption and the degree of diffusion. So, that is how it could be very relevant for a marketer. The second trait which we can relate to innovativeness is dogmatism. So, dogmatism refers to the degree of rigidity within a consumer towards something that is new or something which is unfamiliar, contrary to established preconceptions or ideas or beliefs. So, people who are dogmatic are basically rigid to newer ideas, newer product, newer services, or newer brands. They prefer to go with the familiar rather than approach the unfamiliar, and they approach the they approach the unfamiliar very rigidly. They are not very open to trying out new products, services or brands. So they are more comfortable going along things which they are based on their predispositions or their values and their beliefs. So again, people could be scaled on high or low in levels in terms of in dogmatism. People can be high on dogmatism or people can be low on dogmatism. When one approaches the marketplace or when one approaches anything new or unfamiliar or alien or strange with defense or with greater resistance, we call it high. We say that dogmatism is high. So the person approaches the new or the unfamiliar or the alien or the strange with a high level of rigidity, with a lot of defensiveness, with greater resistance and discomfort in their thought or in their action. So such people are closed minded. And then you have people who are low on dogmatism, where they approach and consider the new or the unfamiliar or anything alien, they without any resistance or without any reluctance. Then they are open to trying out new things, and they approach the unfamiliar without any discomfort or without any resistance or without any reluctance. So they are said to be called as open minded. So people who are high on dogmatism are closed minded, and people who are low on dogmatism are open minded. Now, how is this relevant? How is high dogmatism or low dogmatism relevant for a marketer? In terms of dogmatism, in high, people decide to purchase traditional brands or established brands or time-tested products or brands. So they prefer to go with the familiar rather than approach the new products or brands which they are unfamiliar. So they tend to be very brand loyal to already existing brands or already existing time tested products and brands. They are brand loyal. In order to encourage such consumers from buying our products and services or trying out new products and brands, the marketer needs to use very credible sources. He needs to use authoritative appeals. Credible sources in the form of celebrities or experts should be used, so that they can change the opinion or the values or the predispositions of people who are high on dogmatism. The source has to be extremely credible in the form of an expert, in the form with an authoritative appeal, so that people are accept the message, and people are willing, get mentally prepared and willing to try out new products and brands. So with high dogmatic customers, you have to be very, very careful. You have to put in a lot of effort to make them try out your product or service offering, which is a new product or a new brand. On the other hand, people who are low on dogmatism, they prefer to try out new products or new brands. So they generally they tend to be innovators. For such people, marketer just has to design advertisements that stress upon the features, attributes, benefits, show factual differences between the product vis-a-vis other brands, and try and show how it provides greater value over other existing products or brands or models. So for people who are low on dogmatism, you just need to show, need to be factual and show and portray how the new product provides more value than the existing products, and by designing a attractive message in terms of message content and context, they will be able to convince people to try out the new product or service or the new brand. The third trait which we study is a social character. So we have social character here reflects the degree to which a consumer relies on himself or on others when he is making a purchase decision or forming consumption patterns. Based on social character, a consumer may be inner directed or other directed. So when a person relies on his inner or deep core, when he relies on his values, when he relies on his beliefs and standards in evaluating products and services or brands and taking a final call or taking a final decision with respect to purchase of particular product or alternative or brand, we call him inner directed. On the other hand, other directed are consumers who rely on others who are more socially directed. They look up for social judgment, social opinion, social approval. They look in for social influences in deciding what is right or what is wrong, or what is good or what is bad. So they look up to others for a decision, they look up to others for advice and for approval. So we call them other directed. So how does a marketer deal with people who are inner directed or people who are other directed? Now inner directed, people who are inner directed are going to be high on innovativeness. They will tend to be consumer innovativeness, who will believe in themselves and take a decision on their own. The decision to buy or not to buy rests on them solely. So these people believe that they can make the right decision, they have the capacity, they have the power to make the right decision, and so they will go ahead and take a decision to buy or not to buy based on their own values, their own beliefs and their own attitudes. So marketers basically have to use appeals which are rational and factual. They should provide a lot of facts, focus on product attributes, benefits, features and the value addition, leaving it to the consumer to form his own judgment in assessing the worth of a product or service offering, or to assess the value of a particular brand. On the other hand, when a segment or when people are other directed, they tend to be low on innovativeness. They are socially directed, to look at towards others for opinion, for judgment, for advice. And for such consumers, marketers should basically focus on a social appeal and focus on advertisements that reflect a social environment or a social context and a social approval. So this is how you deal with consumers who are inner directed and those who are other directed. Another trait which relates to innovativeness is OSL, or optimum stimulation levels. Now the optimum stimulation level basically measures the degree of calm or excitement that a person desires. Each one of us has a optimum stimulation level limit. It actually measures the degree of calm we require, or the degree of relaxation we require, or the degree of adventure or the degree of excitement that we require. Some of us desire a very calm life, a very simple, uncluttered, simple, uncomplicated life. Others seek a very busy life. They seek a life which is very complex, very novel, very full of excitement. So depending upon our OSLs, we can be classified into a high OSL or a low OSL. When a person is high on OSLs, he wants a life that is full of excitement, that is full of novelty, that is full of adventure, that is even full of risk taking, and a lot of adventure seeking. On the other hand, when people are low on OSLs, when a person is low on OSL, he prefers a life which is simple, calm. He desires something which is very routine or very, very simple and uncomplex. So how is this relevant again for a marketer? In terms of high OSLs, as a consumer who is high on OSL, such people would be attracted towards novelty, towards something which is unique. They will be willing to take risks, try out new products and services. So by nature they are innovative. The marketer can offer new variants or new models of the same product, or they can come up with changes in the marketing mix so that the consumer finds some novelty in the product or in the 4 Ps all the time. So advertisement should basically focus on creating awareness about the product, also about the features and benefits, to talk about the uniqueness of the product, and it should reflect on the adventure or the excitement or the fun in trying out new products or in the usage of such products. People on the other hand with lowest OSLs are non-innovators. They like to go with the familiar rather than the unfamiliar. They go by the existing patterns of purchase decision and consumption behavior. So generally they tend to become brand loyal. OSLs will also tend to reflect in their lifestyle stimulation. People whose lifestyles are understimulated tend to feel bored and would desire anything which seeks excitement. On the other hand, people who are overstimulated will seek more calm, and they'll desire more of rest and relaxation and calm and quiet. Another trait which we relate to dogmatism is in terms of variety novelty seeking. Now variety novelty seeking basically measures the level of variety that a person seeks in his or her life. especially in reference to purchase of product and services and or brands. So we could have three different types of three different types of this particular trait. We could be exploratory purchase behavior, they could be vicarious exploration, or they could be use innovativeness. So let us first talk of exploratory purchase behavior. So it refers to a switching pattern where a consumer, primarily with the purpose of where he tries when the consume it's a switching pattern within a consumer with the purpose of trying out new products or innovative products or newer brand alternatives, so which are better. So he prefers switching from one product to another or one brand to the other with the purpose of trying out new products or new brands which he thinks would be better alternatives. So in terms of its relevance for a marketer, exploratory purchase behavior makes consumers highly innovative. They are more of risk takers. They're poor on brand loyalty, strong on switchers, or they are very strong as switchers, and marketers basically should try to create awareness about their product or about the brand, in the new product or the new brand, so that such people will be attracted to try out a newer product or newer brand. When we talk of vicarious exploration, it is when a consumer gets to know about a particular product or brand which is new and then consciously attempts to gain information and contemplates a purchase. It is referred to as vicarious exploration. So the consumer here comes to know about a new product or a brand, goes deeper into it, tries to search for more information and more comprehension, and finally contemplates a purchase. So we call it a vicarious exploration. Now such consumers basically are innovative, but they will act on logic, they will act on facts, and they'll act on rationality. So marketers basically need to use a very rational appeal where they would have to explain the product or brand uniqueness in comparison to existing products or brands, and show how the new product or a new brand provides more value, so the benefits or advantages which it provides, along with facts and figures which show that the product has been tested well in use. So this is what we mean by a vicarious exploration. Coming to the third type, which is use innovativeness. In use innovativeness, a person identifies a unique or a novel way of using a particular of an existing product. So the product is an existing product, but the consumer finds out a new way of using it, and so we call it use innovativeness. The consumer prefers to buy a product or a brand that is novel or possesses multiple features, or is even more attractive in the sense that it has multiple uses. So marketer basically needs to provide multiple features and functions, like for example a LPG gas stove with an oven, to attract such consumers. So this is in terms of the different types of personality traits which can get related to innovativeness. Now we come to the second personality trait, which is consumer susceptibility to interpersonal influence. This is again a trait which is more relevant to a marketer and to the study of consumer behavior. Susceptibility to interpersonal influence basically measures the receptiveness of social influence. It shows how it basically reflects on the degree of a person's receptivity or receptiveness to social influence. Now a marketer basically needs to understand how a segment responds to social influence, whether he seeks social judgment, whether he seeks social opinion, whether he seeks social approval in the purchase process or in consumption of goods and services. There is a very famous scale which has been designed to measure a person's susceptibility to interpersonal influence. It's been called the SUSSUP scale, and it measures a person's susceptibility to social influence. The scale has been widely tested, widely used to identify differences amongst people with reference to social influence in their final acceptance or rejection to new products and services or to new brands. So interpersonal influence can basically assume three forms. It is in terms of information influence, utilitarian influence, and value expressive influence. So we have the SUSSUP scale, or which will try measure how people, how receptive people are to other people's judgments or opinions or social approval, and we can study interpersonal influence in terms of value expressive function, utilitarian function, or in terms of information influence. Now, when we talk in terms of information influence, which is an inclination of a person to rely on others for information, it is an inclination or it is a tendency on the part of a person or a consumer to rely on other consumers in his social group, in his social class, could be his family, could be his friends, could be his peers, or anybody in his neighborhood, or anybody in his social class. So these people rely on others for information, and they also readily accept the information which is provided by people in their group. Anything and everything said by family, friends, work, peers, colleagues, or anybody in the social class is readily accepted by such people. So there is an inclination of people to rely on others for information, and they readily accept this information. So we call it information influence. The information could relate to the product or service category, it could relate to the brand, or it could relate to anything with respect to the 4 P's. The other influence which can get exerted in terms of interpersonal influence is value expressive influence. The person basically desires social acceptance and social approval from members of his social class. So in order to be accepted by others in his social class, or in order to get this kind of a social approval, he wants to behave like them, he wants to have a value system which is similar to theirs. So the person desires social acceptance, and in order to gain such acceptance, he behaves in a manner which is similar to them. So he behaves like others in his social group, could be family or could be work peers or colleagues or anybody else, and he would patronize such product and service offerings, or he'll buy such products and service offerings which are used by people in his group or people in his social group or social class. So that he can exhibit the similar values, similar opinions, similar interests, ultimately manifested in the form of a usage of a product or a service offering. So because he wants to behave like others, because he wants to be social, he wants to seek social approval from others, he tends to buy products and services which other people are buying and using. So he tries to behave like others in terms of his purchase decision and consumption pattern. Finally, we have a utilitarian influence. Now here, as a person tries to be conventional, he agrees to have agrees to what have to say in order to win a reward or to avoid a punishment. So he agrees to listen to others in his social group, or he agrees to abide by interpersonal influence, either to be rewarded or to avoid a punishment. He yields to social pressure in order to be benefited like others, or in order to avoid punishment like others. So as a consumer, he will purchase such products and service offerings which people in his social group are using and receiving rewarding reinforcement, and he will try to avoid such products or services which people in his group are not using, and so that he does not he is not punished, or he does not receive any negative reinforcement. So based on, as a consumer, he will patronize such products and services that are rewarding in terms of usage, in terms of experience, in terms of that provide him value for money, and that provide him with some level of customer satisfaction. Now, the third personality trait which relates to consumption patterns and consumer behavior and marketing in the field of marketing is cognitive factors. Cognitive personality traits have also seen to have a big impact on consumer decision making and consumption behavior. We have seen how cognition, how information, or how knowledge has a role to play right across all these stages of consumer decision making, especially with respect to information gathering, information or search, information processing, comprehension, elaboration, retention, retrieval, etc. So cognition has a big role to play all throughout different stages of the decision making. Two traits in particular, which is visualizers versus verbalizers, and high and low need for cognition, are said to have a deeper influence on consumer behavior and consumption patterns. Now this has relevance because based on the segment being a visualizer or a verbalizer, and based on a segment having a high or low need for cognition, marketers need to design their communication strategy both in terms of message and media accordingly. So let us first talk about the visualizer and the verbalizer. So, when we talk about visualizers and verbalizers, we basically are speaking about people who prefer the visual media or people who prefer the written media. So, visualizers will prefer the visual media, or even, and they'll look for product or look for appeal that stresses the visual. And verbalizers prefer the written or the verbal media, and will stress and will prefer a media that stresses the written or the verbal. So, as a visualizer, as a consumer, they prefer the TV or the audiovisual CD to provide them with information rather than an open book to read. So, the marketer must present his communication via visual media, and he should stress on pictures, charts, figures, drawings in order to create awareness or in order to talk about product features, attributes and benefits. On the other hand, verbalizers, as consumers, they would prefer the newspaper or the magazine as a media and would look for information via a brochure or a book. So, marketers should basically use the print media and could supplement it with verbal to educate the consumers about the product or service offering or the brand. Another trait is a need for cognition, ANC, which could be high or low. Those who are in high need for cognition are desirous of information. They love to think and like to collect information, deliberate upon it. So, such consumers prefer a message that is information providing and gives product or service related information in the form of arguments and counter arguments. So, they would process information through the central route to persuasion and prefer the message content rather than the context. On the other hand, you have people who are low on need for cognition, who are low in for thought and deliberation, and such people, they would prefer a message that contains fun, fantasy, music, jingle. So, the focus is message is going to process through the peripheral route to persuasion, and the choice of media, the media here, the focus here is on the context rather than on the message content. So, here we have these two traits, which is high on cognition and low for cognition. Finally, we have another trait which relates to consumer behavior, and that is consumer ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is a feeling of patriotism or a desire to accept your indigenous products and reject foreign made products. So, as consumers, people who are high on ethnocentrism feel that it is undesirable and inappropriate to prefer foreign products over indigenous one, because because of the level of patriotism, the love and affection which you have for your country. Two, because it says that this kind of impact will have the acceptance of foreign made products would have a negative impact on the state of the economy and on the social cultural fabric of the country. So, there is a scale which has been used, which is called the CET scale, CETSCALE, which has been successfully used to measure the level of patriotism, and that it is basically not only patriotism, it is the measure of the love for a particular indigenous product of a country vis-a-vis foreign made product. It basically measures the receptivity of consumers towards foreign made products and services as against indigenous brands. So, this could basically help marketers, especially multinationals, help assess this consumer segment, help assess whether the segment will be viable or profitable in terms of receptivity towards foreign made products. Now, what are the implications of these trade theories? On the basis of trade theories, marketers can implement their strategies, first by identifying segments and then positioning their product, services and designing their mix accordingly. Apart from the above traits which we have just mentioned on innovativeness or on the need for cognition or on ethnocentrism or consumer susceptibility to interpersonal influence. Apart from these trait theories, there are other consumption and general specific traits. We have general personality traits which are general and could be they affect an individual across all kinds of situations, whether purchase related or non-purchase related. And then we have consumption specific traits which are more related to the purchase situation and affect shopping and consumption patterns. So, here we have some examples of general personality traits and which actually affect individual behavior in purchase and non-purchase decisions. In purchase and non-purchase situations, and then you have consumption specific personality traits which talk more about the purchase situation. Now, with this we bring in our discussion on personality and how it impacts consumer behavior, and how it impacts how consumers behave in the marketplace. Now, let us move beyond and discuss the concepts of self-image and self-concept. Now, every individual makes an assessment of himself or herself and forms an opinion about himself. He sees himself as an actual, as an ideal. So, based on this, he acts out a behavior, both general and specific to consumption behavior. Now, this particular the study of self-concept and self-image has emphasis on aspects of personality that are expressive of an individual's image or opinion about him. Consumers hold opinions of their own personality. Many a times, the assessment of self-concept and self-image have a greater impact than even the personality trait. So, while we could make broad conclusions about personality traits, the concepts of self-concept and self-image help us make only specific conclusions about how we behave in the marketplace. Theories related to self-concept indicate relationship between a person and his social system, and conclude how the relationship between a person and his social environment affects his personal makeup. Individual's interaction with others around him affects his personality development through self-concept. Now, what is self-concept? The self-concept basically comprises two concepts: the actual self and the ideal self. Actual self is how people perceive or what he or she, how a person perceives or what he or she is. And ideal self is how it refers to a person's perception of what he or she wants to be. So, the actual is what he is, and the ideal is what he or she would like to be. Now, both these concepts are related to each other, because when we see a person expresses his personality depending upon in two ways, depending upon the priority that is assigned, and the resultant behavior would differ. For example, a person can either act out his actual self and behave as he is, or he acts out in a manner that is close to his ideal self, something he wants to be. So, an individual basically faces a conflict when there is a big difference between the actual and the ideal self, and the choice has to be between actual and ideal. Such individuals are not single self, they are multiple selves, and they will behave differently in different contexts and in different situations. So, as a consumer also, we see the actual and ideal selves come into play in the marketplace. While a consumer tries to relate his personality with the personality of the product or service and the brand, the actual self comes into play. On the other hand, when he tries to match the product or service and the brand personality with an aspirational group or something what he aspires to be, the ideal self comes into play. So, this basically confirms the assumption that self-concept is closely related to personality, and individuals would prefer buying such products and services which match their ideal self, or firstly their actual self or their ideal self, what they would like to be. Consumers exhibit multiple selves, they act out differently in different situations. For example, today a person buys a black color and tomorrow he buys a red color. So, again, whether the actual or ideal self comes into play will depend upon situational factors. It actually includes social visibility of the purchase and the relevance of the purchase in terms of a self-image. This could have implications for a marketer in terms of our market segmentation, whether it is use benefit or whether it is use situation. Talking about self-image, we have trait, characteristics, qualities and mannerisms in behavior all put together which create the image of a person. In terms of marketing also, as consumers, we possess a self-image. So, similar to a relationship between a self-concept and the personality, there also exists a relationship between self-image and personality. Consumers match their product or brand personalities with their self-image, and they prefer buying those products and services or brands where they find a close or a perfect match. In this manner, they attempt to basically reaffirm or confirm their own their self-image, or something that they would like to preserve their self-image. So, based on findings from research in consumer behavior, various kinds of self-image have been perceived. Actual self is how he perceives himself. Ideal is how he would like to perceive himself. Social self-image is how a consumer feels others perceive him or the others think of him. Ideal ideal social self image is how the consumer would like others to perceive him, and expected is how he expects he would be seen in future. So consumers basically seek to alter their self and try to go for personality change. For example, they may go for cosmetic surgery, or they may go for fashion apparel, and basically to reach to an ideal self image or an ideal self. So as a consumer, which of the self images will come into play will depend upon the product or service offering, the situation concerned in terms of visibility of the purchase, as well as the relevance of the product or the service for the person's self image. For example, for convenience goods, the consumer would base his purchase on his actual self image, but for shopping products or for specialty products, he would be guided by the social self image or by the ideal self image. Brand personality, just as individuals have a personality, such similarly brands also have personality. Brand personality refers to a set of characteristics or qualities similar to a human being that become associated with a brand. So the association between a character or trait and between the personal characteristics or the traits and the brand gets generated out in a manner which is positioned by the marketer. So thereafter, consumers match the product and or brand personalities with their own personality, self image and self concept. And some personality traits with examples are like sophistication is Dove or Titan Raga, ruggedness is Levi's Jean or Bajaj Pulsar, competence is Kingfisher Airlines and IBM, sincerity is Life Insurance Corporation or Western Union Money Transfer. So how is the study of consumer personality, self-image and self-concept relevant for a marketer? They have implications for a marketer. They basically, consumer purchase and usage of a product or service offering is reflective of his or her personality, self-concept and self-image. Consumers prefer buying those products or brands where personality matches their own. So for marketers, it is important to know that consumers must know that consumers make purchase decisions to support their personality, self-image and self-concept. So marketers need to bring about congruence between the three, so that between personality, self-image and self-image of the consumer vis-a-vis the brand personality, brand image and the image of the product or service offering. Every person is unique and such personality reflects individual differences. So marketers would have to classify segments accordingly and provide product or services accordingly. Self-concept is closely related with personality, and individuals will buy such products and services or brands which match their concepts and personalities. A consumer tries to relate his personality with the personality of the product or service offering, and the brand, the actual self comes into play. Consumers also exhibit multiple selves, and whether it is actual or ideal self will depend upon the product or service, between the situation and between the relevance of the product or service to the consumer. There also exists a relationship between self-image and brand personality. Consumers match their product or brand personalities with their self-image and buy those products where there will be a close match. The study of personality traits, whether general or consumption specific, or the self-concept and self-image, is relevant for a marketer in the design, development and implementation of marketing strategies. This brings us to a conclusion of our session on personalities, self-image and self-concept. Let's come to the references. Arcel 1992 Consumer Behavior and Marketing Action, Loudon and Della Bitta Consumer Behavior 4th edition Tata McGraw-Hill, Kotler and Keller Marketing Management 13th edition Pearson, Pearson and Olson Consumer Behavior and Marketing Strategy 2005 McGraw-Hill, Schiffman and Kanu Consumer Behavior 8th edition Prentice Hall, and Wells and Prensky Consumer Behavior John Wiley and Sons. Frequently asked questions. Question 1, define self-image, how is it relevant to a marketer? And question 2, what is the trait theory of personality? Coming to a quiz. Section A, true false. Trait theories possess a degree of quantification while classifying individuals into personality types. Is this a true or a false statement? This is a true statement. Statement 2, the SESEP scale has been designed to assess consumers' feeling for ethnocentrism and patriotism. This is a false statement. It has been designed to assess consumers' susceptibility to interpersonal influence. So this statement is a false statement. Social character reflects the degree to which consumers rely on others or on others or on self in making purchase decisions and forming consumption patterns. Is this a true or a false statement? This is a true statement. Question 4, when a person is low on OSL, he seeks a life that is novel and full of excitement. This is again a false statement. When he is high on OSL, he seeks life that is novel and full of excitement. Fill in the blanks. The DASH scale measures susceptibility to interpersonal influence, measures a person's receptivity to social influence. The DASH scale, the SUSCEP scale, SUSCEP. Question number 2, DASH is illustrative of a person's feeling of patriotism and resultant desire to accept or reject foreign made products and or brands. So, ethnocentrism is illustrative of a person's feeling of patriotism. Answer is ethnocentrism. Third question, the self concept comprises two components, DASH and ideal self. So, it is actual self and ideal self. 4, consumers also exhibit DASH and the same consumer would act differently at different times with different people. So, consumers exhibit multiple selves. DASH refers to a set of characteristics or qualities similar to human beings that being associated with a brand. So, brand personality refers to a set of characteristics or qualities similar to human beings that become associated with a brand. Question number 6, the group of researchers who laid emphasis on the process of socialization as its impact on personality came to be known as the DASH. They came to be known as the Neo-Freudians. Multiple choice questions. When a consumer gets to know about a product or a brand and then consciously attempts to gain more information and contemplate purchase, it is referred to as A, variety novelty seeking, B, vicarious exploration, 3, exploratory purchase behavior, D, none of the above. The answer is B, vicarious exploration. Second, based on the traits, the consumers can be classified into groups, labeling the consumers as being of certain personality dash, type, group, class or none of the above. So, the answer is personality type, which is A. Which of the following pairs is wrong? Inferiority complex is something that arose out of a sense of inferiority or inadequacy. Adler. Id, superego, ego, Homey. Social relationships were extremely important for human beings. Refer to such causes as interactional, Sullivan. Or D, all of the above. The answer is B, which is id, ego and superego by Homey. This pair is a false pair or a wrong pair. It is id, ego and superego is by Freud. Finally, coming to short answers, name any two Neo-Freudians. So, Adler, Sullivan and Karen Homey. Homey classified people into 3 groups. Mention the groups: compliant, aggressive and detached. Differentiate between general and consumption specific personality traits. Okay, so you have those traits which accept purchase and non-purchase related situations or affect individuals across all kinds of situations. We call them general traits, and consumption specific traits are those which are related to the purchase situation. And innovativeness gets related to other personality traits. Name any 3 of them: dogmatism, social character, OSLs and variety novelty seeking. So, this brings us to an end of our session on personality, self-concept and self-image, and this brings us to a conclusion of our lecture on module 6.3. We will begin with module 6.4 in the next class. Thank you.